The enemy has changed a lot since 9/11. I think we often lose sight of the fact that today's Al-Qaeda is not the same as yesterday's Al-Qaeda. We have an enemy that is nimble, constantly adapting, constantly changing to new challenges and seeking new ways to do us harm. But the United States intelligence community, on the other hand, is stuck still in a Cold War model that recruits spies at diplomatic cocktail parties and still has a hard time adjusting to this new enemy, now 16 years after the end of the Cold War. During the Cold War, our enemy was very clear. The Soviet Union wore uniforms and paraded its nuclear weapons through Red Square. We had a very clear idea of who we were up against and what capabilities they had. Today, by contrast, terrorists deliberately hide from view. There's no territory on a map, there's no embassy we can call, and weapons, lethal weapons, can now fit inside a suitcase or a vial. So the enemy is very different and far more difficult than we've ever faced before. It's important to put the threat into perspective. If we think about the Cold War, Americans lived under the shadow of nuclear annihilation every day. The threat of total world destruction was far greater than it is today. The sad fact is, I think over time, we will have to get accustomed to the threat that terrorists pose to any individual city or place in the United States. And that's what we're going to have to live with. But the terrorist threat is not going away anytime soon. We still have to fear Osama Bin Laden, but Al-Qaeda is much bigger than one person. If we killed Osama Bin Laden tomorrow, Al-Qaeda would not put a sign on its door saying, "Gone fishing, we're out of business," right? This is a threat that is a network of loosely affiliated terrorist organizations that span dozens of countries. And yes, it would put a crimp in the organization to remove him as a symbol of the movement, but it would not in any way put an end to the terrorist threat. We're not going to be able to take pictures of Al-Qaeda capabilities from satellites in space like we could during the Cold War. Understanding Al-Qaeda and getting the information requires getting inside those cells, getting people who are willing to betray their comrades in arms and tell us what these plots are about. So it's the human piece that's really critical now more than it's ever been. That's only half of the solution. The other half is to address the root causes of terrorism so terrorists don't want to attack Americans and kill them. It's not clear to me that anyone has a very clear idea of how to do that. We know, for example, that poverty isn't directly connected to terrorism, that the 9/11 hijackers, for example, were not the most impoverished people in the Middle East. They were from relatively well-off families, well-educated families. So the president believes that spreading democracy in the Middle East will ultimately put an end to terrorism. But the short answer is nobody knows how to solve the root causes of this problem. In the good old days, terrorist groups would use limited violence to try to achieve concrete political aims. Think about the IRA, for example, or the PLO is another example. In today's world, this fundamentalist Islamic kind of terrorism that Al-Qaeda espouses aims to do one thing, and that is to kill as many Americans and our allies as possible. There is no list of demands that if we met, Al-Qaeda would declare victory and stop trying to attack us. Although Osama bin Laden has talked about Israel, has talked about U.S. troops in Saudi Arabia, if we did all of the things that he has ever mentioned in any of his addresses, Al-Qaeda would still want to kill us, and that's the big difference. I think what's new in history is that great powers are now threatened by weak players, not strong players. And so that is a huge difference in the history of international relations. What that means is that our first and last line of defense as a nation is no longer military might. It's not nuclear weapons or how many thousands of officers we have in uniform or enlisted people in uniform. It's intelligence. Intelligence is what's going to save American lives now more than ever before.